Now I would like to welcome Professor Avi Shlaim, who will be providing a keynote speech.
When Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, it turned the enclave into an open-air prison. For the last 3 weeks, with the incessant bombardment of Gaza by land, sea, and air, Israel is turning Gaza into an open graveyard, a desolate wasteland. Last week, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, addressed the Security Council, and he said the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the context of 56 years of suffocating Israeli occupation. The Israeli permanent representative to the United Nations, Mr. Erdan, responded with a vicious personal attack on the Secretary General, saying that the Secretary General accused Israel of blood libel, which he never did, calling for his resignation, and topping it up with a call on members of the United Nations to stop funding the organization. Israeli antagonism to the UN and obstruction of its work is nothing new. But the contrast between the decency and humanity of the Secretary General and the rudeness and crudeness of the Israeli representative was very striking. As the Secretary General said, the Israel-Hamas conflict did not begin on the 7th of October. In June 1967, Israel occupied not just Gaza, but the West Bank and Jerusalem. This is the most protracted and brutal military occupation of modern times. In 2005, Israel withdrew unilaterally. Israel withdrew its soldiers and settlers from the Gaza Strip. Israeli spokespersons said that by withdrawing, they gave the Gazans an opportunity to turn Gaza into the Singapore of the Middle East. I've never heard anything more preposterous in my life. Between 1967 and 2005, Gaza was a classic colonial situation. A few thousand Israeli settlers controlled 25% of the territory, 40% of the arable land, and the lion's share of the desperately short, desperately scarce water resources. Gaza is not backward, poor, impoverished because the Gazans are lazy. Gaza is poor because of the Israeli strategy of de-development. Sarah Roy, a Jewish scholar at Harvard, the daughter of Holocaust survivors, is the leading expert on the Gaza Strip. She's written 4 books. Her first book was called The Gaza Strip, The Political Economy of De-Development. And there she shows in detail how Israel deliberately prevented Gaza from developing and exploited Gaza as a source of cheap labor and a market for its goods. There were 2 reasons for the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. One is that the price of occupation became too high. Hamas was conducting operations against the Israeli settlers and the Israeli army, and the price of occupation was simply too great to sustain. That was one reason for withdrawing. The second reason was demography. Palestinians have a higher birth rate than Israelis, and the Israelis talk about the demographic bomb, that the increase in number of Palestinians. For me, this is not a bomb and not a threat that Palestinians have children on their own land. But for Israelis, it's a threat. And by withdrawing from Gaza, Israel took out 1.4 million Palestinians from the demographic equation. Ariel Sharon claimed that by withdrawing from Gaza, he was making a contribution to peace. But this was a unilateral Israeli move undertaken in what was considered to be Israeli national interests. And the official name was the unilateral disengagement from Gaza. The aim was not to the withdrawal from Gaza was not a prelude to further withdrawals from the West Bank. On the contrary, in the year after withdrawing 8,000 settlers from Gaza, Israel introduced 12,000 new settlers into the West Bank. Today, there are around 700,000 settlers on the West Bank and in Jerusalem. The aim of the Sharon government was to redraw unilaterally, not by negotiations, to redraw unilaterally the borders of Greater Israel. The first step was the withdrawal from Gaza. The second step was the so-called security barrier on the West Bank. The security barrier was said to be a temporary security measure, but it wasn't. The security barrier is more about land grabbing than it is about security. And the barrier is intended to mark the final borders of Greater Israel. So the move was anchored in a fundamental rejection of Palestinian national rights. It was anchored in a determination to prevent the Palestinians from ever achieving independence on their own land. Moreover, by withdrawing from Gaza, Israel enabled the Israeli Air Force to bomb Gaza at will, as they have been doing non-stop for the last 3 weeks, something they couldn't do when there were Israeli settlers in Gaza. In January 2006, Hamas won a fair and free election in all Palestine elections, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank as well, and proceeded to form a government. Israel refused to recognize this government and resorted to economic warfare to undermine it. And the United States and European Union, to their eternal shame, followed Israel in refusing to recognize the democratically elected government, and also resorted and joined Israel in economic warfare to undermine that government. This is just one example out of many of Western hypocrisy in this conflict. The Western leaders say that they believe in democracy. They invaded Iraq, my homeland, in the name of democracy and completely destroyed it. And here there was a remarkable example of democracy in action. The Palestinians, under incredibly difficult conditions of military occupation, had a really good example of democracy in action. The people spoke, but the Western governments refused to recognize the result of the election because the people had voted for the wrong party. Worse was to come. And we know this, that there was a plot to topple Hamas. We know this from the Palestine papers, a cache of 1,600 official documents that were leaked to Al Jazeera, which showed that a secret committee was formed called the Gaza Committee, and there were 4 members of that committee: Fatah, Israel, an American general, and Egyptian intelligence. And the aim of this committee was to isolate and weaken Hamas, possibly even to instigate a civil war, with the aim to encourage Fatah to stage a coup and to recapture power. The aim of the plot was to drive Hamas from power. Hamas responded by preempting the Fatah coup and seizing power violently in Gaza. This was I forgot to say that in June 2007, Hamas and Fatah formed a national unity government. It was a very moderate government. It consisted mainly of technocrats rather than politicians, and it called for negotiating with Israel a long-term ceasefire. And long-term was defined as 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, maybe 50 years, long-term ceasefire. Israel refused to negotiate. And then Hamas was forced to preempt the Fatah coup, and it seized power in Gaza. And since then, the 2 branches of the Palestinian family have been divided and kept by Israel strictly apart, with Hamas ruling over Gaza and the Palestinian Authority ruling over the West Bank from Ramallah. Israel's next move was to impose a blockade on Gaza, a blockade that people forget has been in force for the last 16 years. For the last 16 years, there's been an Israeli blockade of Gaza, which involved incredible hardship for the inhabitants and is illegal. A blockade is a form of collective punishment which is prescribed by international law. Having been denied the fruit of its electoral victory, Hamas resorted to the weapon of the week, to terrorism, and this took the form of rocket attacks from Gaza to southern Israel. Then there was a tit-for-tat and an escalation of hostilities. In June 2008, Egypt brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. The ceasefire worked really well. In the 6 months before June, the average number of rockets that hit Israel was 179. In the following months, the average monthly was 3 rockets. And by launching on the 4th of November 2008, a raid into Gaza, which killed 6 Hamas lawyers, Israel violated the ceasefire and hostilities resumed. Hamas has an impeccable record of observing ceasefires. Every ceasefire brokered by Egypt, every single one has been violated by Israel when it no longer suited it. The first Israeli onslaught on Gaza in 2009 was called Operation Cast Lead. The reason given for it was self-defense, that Israel, like any other country, has the right to defend itself and to defend its citizens. But if all Israel wanted was to protect its citizens, all it had to do was to follow Hamas's good example and observe the ceasefire. This was the first major assault, Israeli assault, on the people of Gaza, and I use the word the people of Gaza deliberately. It involved very heavy casualties and huge damage to the civilian infrastructure. The United Nations Human Rights Council appointed a commission of inquiry headed by the South African judge Richard Goldstone, who happened to be both Jewish and a Zionist. The Goldstone Report was issued. It is a remarkable document. It's 575 pages. It details 33 episodes and war crimes. The report says both sides were guilty of war crimes, but they reserved the severest criticisms for Israel because of the scale of its war crimes. I'll give you just one example. Goldstone and his colleagues found 7 incidents in which Israeli soldiers shot civilians leaving their homes on orders from the IDF holding a white flag. Can you see echoes of today? The conclusion of the report was that the attacks were directed, at least in part, at the people of Gaza as a whole. It was, quote, a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population, unquote. I'll repeat this in case you didn't hear it. It was a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population, unquote. There have been many more Israeli onslaughts on Gaza. In 2012, 2014, 2021, 2022, and 2023. So by my count, this is the 6th serious Israeli onslaught on Gaza. I'm not going to go into any of the subsequent attacks, but I want to say this about the pattern of Israeli behavior. Israeli generals have a phrase, mowing the lawn, which means cutting the grass. It's a chilling metaphor. What it means is that they have no solution to the problem, but every few years the IDF moves in with a lot of weaponry, the most advanced weaponry. They smash up the place, they degrade the military capabilities of Hamas, they inflict severe damage on the civilian infrastructure, and then they go home and leave the problem completely unresolved. And it's a chilling metaphor because it's a mechanical action that you do periodically every few years and with no end. So there is no end to the bloodshed, and the next war is always round the corner. And it's not a policy for dealing with Gaza, it's a non-policy, or rather, it's a military response to the problem. And there is an Israeli saying that if force doesn't work, use more force. But this is an asinine idea. If force doesn't work, it's because it's not an appropriate method for dealing with a political problem. And Israel's disproportionate, excessive use of brute military force ended up by encouraging the rise of Hezbollah in Lebanon and of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The current government formed by Netanyahu at the end of last year is the most radical, the most extreme, and the most incompetent government in Israel's history. The policy guidelines of this government say, quote, the Jewish people have an exclusive and inalienable right to all parts of the land of Israel. In other words, only Jews have a right to the whole land of Israel. Palestinians have no rights. And it's this extreme position which makes bloodshed inevitable, because there is no peaceful way to assert Palestinian rights. In the current situation, Israel has a new war aim, which is to eliminate Hamas as a political and military force. This is new. And it's rather surprising that the aim now is to dismantle Hamas, because here is what Netanyahu said to his Likud colleagues in March 2019, and I quote, "Anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. That is part of our strategy, to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank." On the 7th of October, this cynical policy of Netanyahu collapsed spectacularly. His policy was to keep the Palestinian Authority weak, to allow Israel a free hand to do whatever it liked on the West Bank, and to use the Palestinian Authority as a subcontractor for Israeli security, and then to keep the Palestinians in Gaza cooped up in the open-air prison and to contain them there. Well, the inmates of the prison broke out on the 7th of October, and the whole policy collapsed overnight. Netanyahu had also been saying, the Palestinians are finished, they are defeated, they are irrelevant, we can do whatever we want, and we can have peace with the Arab world without making any concessions to the Palestinians. And I'm sorry to say that the Abraham Accords vindicated Netanyahu. The Abraham Accords with Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Sudan gave Netanyahu what he wanted, peace for peace, without any price being paid by Israel, without any concessions on the Palestinian issue. Now his policy is in tatters, and he will pay the political price, because before the 7th of October, there was massive protest to his judicial reform or judicial overhaul. But that protest and opposition ceased on the 7th of October, and now all Israelis are focused on the situation in Gaza. but when the war ends, and it may take a long time, the anger would be redirected at Netanyahu. And one commentator said that Netanyahu is a dead man walking. I hope so, but it's too soon to write him off. One thing is clear. He's a thoroughly unscrupulous leader, mendacious and unscrupulous. On the 2nd of June, 1948, Sir John Troutbeck, a senior official in the Foreign Office, wrote a memo to Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin. And in it, he complained that the Americans, by helping the creation of the State of Israel, that the Americans helped to create, quote, a gangster state with a thoroughly unscrupulous set of leaders. I wouldn't call Israel a gangster state, but I would certainly call Netanyahu thoroughly unscrupulous. And uniquely, well, extraordinarily selfish, because he's on trial for 3 very serious corruption charges, and he knows that if he goes to trial, he will be convicted and he will end up in jail. So everything he's doing revolves around political survival and staying out of jail, whatever the damage to Israelis and to his country. One disturbing aspect of the Israeli handling, the Israeli response to the attack of the 7th of October, is the dehumanizing of the Palestinian people. This is nothing new. On one occasion, Netanyahu famously suggested that it was Haj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinian National Movement, who suggested to Hitler that instead of expelling the Jews from Germany, he should exterminate them. Today, many Israeli ministers are talking about Palestinians as Nazis. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, spoke of the Palestinians. He said, we are fighting human animals. And he used this view of the Palestinians to justify the siege that he imposed, the cutting off of water, food, fuel, and medical supplies to 2.3 million people. Dehumanizing a whole people can lead to genocide. Hans Kohn, spelled C-O-H-N, wrote a famous book long ago called Warrant for Genocide. And in that book, he detailed the causal link between the Nazi dehumanizing of the Jews and the Holocaust, the extermination of the Jews. The Western response to the crisis is the usual hypocrisy and ruthless double standards, but this time it's been taken to a new level. The Western love of Israel has always been accompanied, has always depended on the erasing of Palestinian history and humanity. Deep concern for Israel's security is reiterated all the time by all Western leaders, but no thought is given to Palestinian security. Evidently, the Palestinians are children of a lesser God. There's been a pilgrimage of Western leaders to Jerusalem to demonstrate that they are standing by Israel. Palestinian resistance has been decontextualized and dehistoricized. The Palestinians are engaged in an anti-colonial struggle, possibly the last anti-colonial struggle in today's world. But the struggle is attributed to religious fanaticism and irrational hatred of Jews rather than to the normal, universal desire of all people to live in freedom and dignity on its land. There is an echo here of the habitual colonial tendency to treat struggles for national liberation as proof of the savagery, barbarism, and terrorism of the indigenous population. This is how the civilized world, in inverted commas, responded to the liberation struggles of South Africans, Algerians, Kenyans, and Vietnamese. And this is how the West views the Palestinian struggle and Palestinian resistance today. The United States and the United Kingdom are giving Israel not only moral but material and military support. Joe Biden has said that the attack of the 7th of October is the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. This is to trivialize the Holocaust. America has sent 2 aircraft carriers to the eastern Mediterranean, ostensibly to deter Hezbollah and Iran. But what it is actually doing is shielding Israel, allowing Israel to carry on with the mass slaughter in Gaza. So what America is doing and Britain is doing is to give Israel warrant for genocide. In the last address to the nation, Netanyahu said that the Israelis are fighting the second war of independence. This is completely preposterous. It doesn't make any sense, but it is very worrying because in 1948, which was called Israel's War of Independence, 1948 was accompanied by the Nakba, by the catastrophe. And I fear that this so-called Second War of Independence will be accompanied by a second Nakba. My time is up, but if I may, I would like to conclude by quoting something that William Gladstone said in the House of Commons in 1876. He was the leader of the opposition. The Prime Minister was Benjamin Disraeli. And this is not an exact quote. It's what I remember from when I was an 18-year-old schoolboy in London doing A-level British history. Gladstone said the context was soldiers of the Ottoman Empire committed atrocities in Bulgaria. And Gladstone said, and now I hope the Turks will carry off their abuses by carrying off themselves. The Zeftis and the Mudirs, the Bimbashis and the Yuzbashis shall all, I hope, clear one and all from the province that they have desolated and profaned. This is how I feel about Israel and Gaza today. Thank you for listening.